Hello, this is probably going to be a standalone video, and it's kind of a reply to the commenters on yesterday's video, with the principal subject being what I'll just call socialism. Not easy, not an easy subject. Right, I'll just kick off with, just to get us into the way of the game. In the UK Telegraph this morning is an article entitled "Paul Krugman is rewriting history now that the Eurozone, beloved by US liberals, is going down in flames." Now, I'm sure if I looked around the interwebs I would find dozens, literally, dozens at least, of articles having a go at Krugman for what he's been saying about what I quoted him saying yesterday. And just to repeat on that was that it's not necessarily the socialism, and I won't expand on what I mean by socialism. I've just got, because there are so many different definitions, that we'll just ease into it. And basically you just keep your idea of socialism and use it as though I was talking about what you're thinking what socialism is. What we had yesterday was Krugman saying that Greece, Portugal, Italy, Spain, Ireland does not have as much socialism as Holland, Germany and Sweden. Now, Sweden was always a dodgy example to put in there, but let's just say Germany, because we all think, again, we have an idea about what Germany is, some sort of industrial powerhouse that's really doing rather well. Now, there's a lot of non-truth in that, but we'll just go with it. So we can at least think that it isn't nail-it-on socialism that has brought down these countries, Portugal, Spain, Italy and all those, because as Krugman points out, there is, to varying degrees, more socialism in Germany than there is in those countries. That's the basic idea anyway, and it can be argued this way and that, but I'm hopefully not going to go anywhere near that today. All I'm going to do is say, okay, Paulie's got a point there. So it's not just that socialism. We've got to look for something more. That's all I'm saying. Right. So I think we need a bit of history to get into this. Now, I don't actually know how this video is going to end, so I don't know that we're going to get out of this, but at least to get into it, we've got to go for a bit of history. And a rough out in my head, and trying to keep such a huge subject channeled a bit, it's going to have to be very broad brush, as they say. In the United States, there was the Great Depression of the 30s that caused things to happen. I'll go with two main things. The mentality of the people, if not changed, was certainly established in a certain way that, you know, even if you're old enough, your grandparents probably kept rubber bands in a box in a drawer in the kitchen. That sort of thing. You know what I mean by that. Because in that generation, every single rubber band became valuable. It was wealth. And that's the way it was. So their mentality was changed into that. Okay, that's the people. On the other side of that, or anyway, running alongside that, was the government's position of social spending to get out of the depression, and whether it did or not we can't go into because we haven't got time, but huge government spending put in place social systems and agencies to help the country out of the depression and to help the people with being in the depression so they didn't sink into oblivion. I mean, a few died, but not, you know, not millions. I don't think millions died, did they? No. Anyway, so what we had was the United States going from completely, let's say, laissez-faire of the 19th century into the 20th century. By the 40s, lots of socialist, what I'm calling socialism, socialistic programs were in place. Okay. And the cost of the war. So that's what we've got in 1945. Huge government outlay, huge debt. Right. Over in Europe, things were slightly different, but a similar sort of thing came to pass. The cost of the war, or wars, First World War and Second World War, had the main European countries deep in debt. But as opposed to getting out of the Depression, they had another problem, which was communism. Communism at the end of the Second World War was a great danger to the political class at that time. So they instigated huge social spending so the people would be happy, and be happy enough that they would reject communism. But the result of those two ways of going about things, or things that happened, the United States and Europe ended up in, let's say, 1950 with very large debts and very large socialism. Let's just say keep on with this socialism thing. Now, I'll leave out the rest of the world because that would get too complicated. Now, that was 1950, and now we're in 2010, so that's 60 years ago. So we've got a couple of generations, or 2.5 generations, has happened since. So we can ask ourselves next, well, what has happened to reduce those government debts on the European countries and the United States? And we've dealt with this. It's what Carmen Reinhardt calls financial repression, pulling down interest rates to a very low number and getting inflation to a slightly higher number. Let's say interest rate to 2%, inflation rate 5 or 6%. And in that, over years, moving into decades, because these debts were huge, debts get paid down because of the inflation and new wage rises going in as well. Your ability to pay off old debts is obviously increased. So we've had, let's say, a cut-off point of, well, where to cut it off, I don't know. It doesn't matter. Let's keep going with this. So the governments instigated these policies, or this policy of financial repression, which got the governments out of their debts. As more taxes were coming in with bigger numbers on them, paying off the old numbers was easier. It's classic inflation. It took from the mentality of the people in the 30s, 40s, into the 50s, into the 60s, into the 70s, more and more of the people were starting to click on to what was happening in the macroeconomy, but still they were restricted by their own mentality and their what would have been their parents' lessons of never a lender or a borrower be, that they were not taking out loans as much as the government was. So no, that's not a good way of saying it. They went on the right side of the financial repression. Because to be on the right side is to borrow huge, knowing that the government will keep this inflation thing going, and your debts, along with theirs, will be paid off by, or made easier by, inflation. But by the 80s, two things had happened. We got the Thatcher-Reagan revolution, which freed up the financial system to lend more, and the mentality of this generation had started not listening to their parents / grandparents, never a borrower or a lender be, and they got this certain understanding that if I buy a house, for instance, now, in 10 years' time even, the amount of wages I'll be getting will make that mortgage easy to pay off, really easy to pay off. So people then were starting to take out more and more and more loans. Then we move on, not another generation, another 10 years, 20 years, and then we've got the full flourishing of the financial freedom to lend anything to anybody, and that went along with that the freedom of the mentality of the people to borrow, to borrow as much as possible. The people had then forgotten why they were borrowing so wildly, and the financial people had forgotten why they were lending so readily. It was just that everybody was doing it. All the financial people were lending, and all the people were borrowing. And for a while, it all worked out fine, because there was always this inflation, which meant for rising of wages, and the rising of wages made it easier to pay the debts back. Okay, right, okay, I can see an end to this now. What happened to make an end to it, and that's the end to it that we've got now, because I've kind of gone off socialism, but socialism was always payable on the same system of making promises of this much to these people, and more taxes coming in with a bigger number on them was able to pay the promises that were made 5-10 years ago. Then we got inflation banded pensions and things like this, where they started promising people that as inflation rose, their payments out would also rise up. Now, this was cranking on something that hadn't happened before, when everybody realised that it had to go this way, because the mentality of the people had caught up with the economic reality. This started making the socialism unrealistic, because the inflation wasn't then getting ahead of the promises. But let's just finish off, and then we'll go back to that. Let's finish off with how the inflation financial economic reality is different for the two parties that I've been talking about, the government and the people. Government's debts, when taken out, are rolled over and 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 rolled over to eternity. So as long as they can keep inflation going, they can, if the debts get too high, they just have to go to this financial repression thing, get inflation up a bit and start paying the debts off, and it'll always work, and it can be rolled over and rolled over and rolled over for eternity. There are two problems. Let's go to the households now. But for the people who started on this same way of doing things, this modus operandi of borrowing and borrowing, there is a complete difference, besides the fact that they can't print money. The difference for households is they can't roll it over and roll it over and roll it over forever and ever and ever. When a person takes a debt out, it is generally to be paid off, certainly in their lifetime, normally before their lifetime. And that is a really big difference, that they have to, they haven't got the open-ended thing that the governments have to roll things on over generations and generations. They have to pay it off in that lifetime, or in their lifetime. You can imagine credit cards, you can roll it over and roll it over, but as you get older, they'll start clocking this and going, you're getting older now, and start really screwing you to get the money out of you before you die. And this makes for a huge difference, because what we've got now is governments that are totally loaded up with debt. Now, I would say that governments generally could still all roll and roll and roll and roll over their debts. I can't say all of them, I mean, because we've looked into it so much now, and countries like Greece, where wildly wrong. But even if nothing else had happened, Greece could have just rolled and rolled and rolled things over. They would have run into some sort of trouble somewhere along the line, because they're now not in control of their currency, so they can't depreciate the currency. That was another trick governments had. And they can't control the inflation. The inflation they would like to be higher, but it's German inflation, which is 2%. If they had nice 5% inflation, they could roll and roll and roll as well. But going into the euro has changed, as Krugman says, changed what governments can actually do. But back to the people. The people have loaded up so much on the debt, their personal debt, and they can't roll and roll and roll it over, that we've come to a time where it's stop. It's stop because the people have tried to do what governments have done for generations. Now, governments, as I say, I think could generally keep rolling it over for more and more generations using the tricks that they've learned over the past generations. But personal people, like countries in the Eurozone, do not have this facility, and they are full up. And they have just got to stop. And especially in the UK and the US, in aggregate, they've just got to stop. So what's going to happen now is, what is happening now is that the taxes aren't going into the government to pay their debts off, because the people aren't rolling over, they can't roll over their debts because they're full up. They have been borrowing more money to pay off past debts as governments did, but there's a limit to it when you're a private individual, and that limit, glass ceiling, has been hit. Okay, so we're there now for the people, and that's got knock-on effects for the government. I think I'll finish there, because if it's going on too long. If I go on again, it'll take us to a far too long video. So I think that's what we've got. We've got governments that could, non-Euro governments, because they've tied themselves into a household type knot. US and UK could have rolled over their debts forever, but their people have got themselves in aggregate to a level of debt which has stopped the economy. The economies of the OECD have been running on this system. This, we'll call it, if it had one word, it would be the inflation system. It's been running on the inflation system since the 40s. And it's not something you can get off. It's like a car runs on gas, petrol. The television runs on electricity. It's the way the system works. It runs on inflation, and you just can't turn that off. And I'll just leave you now to plug all that information into the socialist welfare programs and see what you can make of it. Because if I started on that as where I was going to go, I'd be here all morning. But I'll leave that for the video. Yeah? Yeah. Bye.